Okay, ladies and gentlemen, let's take a look at the political eras and issues surrounding the United States of America. Um, so there are four modern political eras. One is Cold War and civil rights from after World War II to 1989. You have the Soviet Union being contained, eventually defeated. You see the end of segregation and the growth of the civil rights movement. Massive economic growth post World War II up until 1980. The baby boomers, a lot of people come out of poverty into the middle class. You have the countercultural movement in the 1960s, and then the Republican Revolution and the new right that happens in the 1980s. You have post Cold War, you have the growth of the internet and the rise of American culture and soft power around the world. Democratic states increase and blossom. You see like 30 different new democratic countries that come out of the Cold War and the increase in trade and globalization. Post 9/11, you have this 10-year span in the 20 aughts where the war on terrorism happens. You have the Great Recession, the second or third worst economic time in American history. You have the rise of social media, the recognition that climate change becomes an issue, and this rise of cultural progressivism that occurs in the late 20 aughts, early 20 teens. And now the current time is seen as a time of political polarization, which we're going to kind of talk about. That goes from 2012 to the president. You have President Donald Trump and the issues around him. You have two huge movements: the Me Too movement, the Black Lives Matter movement. The, and Black Lives Matter starts in 2014. You have the January 6th coup attempt in 2021, and then you have the issues in Israel, Taiwan, and Ukraine, and an overall decline in global democratic states. Um, so let's talk about major issues in American society. One, this is called political polarization. I'm going to rephrase it into like an emotional polarization that's happening in American society because most Americans actually do agree with politics. Most Americans actually support a woman's right to an abortion, but also having restrictions on that right. Most Americans support guns, but also support having restrictions on guns. Most Americans support legalizing cannabis, allowing gays to marry, and they trust the military. Most Americans overlap on this policy, and the differences are at the margin. The thing is, you have politicians in society that magnify this gap in terms of politics. And this is where you have the progressive movement on the left and the MAGA movement on the right are stretching themselves out in either direction to a point to where they are really loud, and it's not even about, "Hey, we wanna come to a consensus or come to an understanding about a policy issue." We're just gonna hate the other side intensely, and we're gonna be super vocal about hating the other side intensely. So you can't really ever they take an enormous amount of energy. Most moderates, most Americans, don't agree with either side and really don't agree, but they're just not loud like they are. And what this has created is an environment where some politics has become anti-democratic. So you see more corruption, you see voter suppression, gerrymandering, you see violent protests from both sides. You start seeing increases in anti-democratic censorship, whether it's the banning of books regarding race, gender, sexuality, the suppression of internet freedom, cancel culture, getting people fired from jobs or putting them on lists or blacklisting them, yelling down speakers. You see this on college campuses that certain people shouldn't be allowed to talk about things or that certain speech should not be allowed. You see then, actual political violence, whether it's anti Semitism, whether you have radicals actually attacking moderates, threatening them, swatting them, those kinds of things. And then the rise in overall white nationalism. This is kind of what this emotional polarization has created in our society. It is a significant issue. Um, and it does impact American democracy because for healthy democracy, you got to ask, are your civil rights and civil liberties increasing? And the answer is since 2010, they have not. Freedom House looks at democracies around the world in every country, and they have basically dropped the United States from being a totally free state to um, it's still a democratic state, but it is getting into that like not as free as it should be realm. A lot of this has to do with corruption, the connection of money into politics, a lack of transparency in government, and punitive government actions regarding things like immigration, abortion, capital punishment, that kind of thing. So the current score democratically is an 83, and it's been an 83 since 2020. We want to see that overall Democratic score rise because the world does see the United States as an arsenal of democracy. And there have been 469 military interventions around the world in the name of protecting democracy. It doesn't always work out that way. Has it in the past? When you look at World War One and Two, the United States literally saved the world from fascism. Korea, same thing. Cold War was against a dictatorial Soviet government. Persian Gulf War, Somalia, Bosnia, and now currently Ukraine, all protecting lives, property, and democracy. They have also abused that power. The Filipino War of Independence killed hundreds of thousands of people during the Spanish American War. Vietnam, proxy war, especially in Central and South America during the Cold War. The war on terror, Afghanistan and Iraq actually changed the landscape of the Middle East and contributed to the current problems in the world. So the United States needs to get its in-house in order and then make sure it projects that image of being that shining beacon of democracy appropriately around the world. The United States still needs to deal with some of its worst actions it has done in history and how you get current and future economic well-being to these groups better off. The United States is still suffering some of the issues from slavery and segregation. Remember, segregation did not really go away until the 1970s, and blacks were not allowed to um, partake in the ability to buy homes and then transfer that wealth onto their kids. And so there is a significant disparity, from 43,000 to around $68,000 in terms of GDP per capita for a black family versus a white family. How do you create that equilibrium? How do we get blacks into a better economic, political, and social standing in society? The United States is still dealing with that. How do we bring the poorest populations in the United States, Native American reservations? How do we like reconcile with the fact that um, and we can talk about colonization all you want. Every country, every part of this planet has been colonized by some other part of the planet at some point in its history. But there was, when you look at California, an attempted genocide of a group of people, and that group of people are on reservations that are economically really, really, really poor and poor off. How do you bring these groups back into society, into creating a greater economic well-being? How do you take the indigenous culture and mix it into what it means to be part of the United States? Because right now it's something that we are not dealing with well at all. Japanese internment occurred in the 1940s, where American citizens were sent to internment camps in the high deserts. Population of Japanese ancestry is doing much better than the previous two populations. That doesn't mean that there wasn't, a significant amount of emotional trauma to something that literally just happened like 60, 70 years ago. And how do we prevent this from ever happening again? It was even whispers of it during after 9/11 about potentially, Arab populations being rounded up. Didn't occur, which is good. That's a step forward in the right direction, but you want to learn from history. Next major issue: why is American life expectancy flat or worse than other developed countries? And when I mean worse, I mean it is not a little worse, it is getting progressively worse since the 20 teens. Well, it's a combination of things and it has nothing to do with money because the United States per capita spends more on healthcare than any other developed country in the world. And it's not even close, but it is not getting outcomes. You might say, well, it's because we don't nationalize healthcare. Well, uh, there are plenty of countries in Europe that nationalized healthcare, and their outcomes are not any better. And in a place like the UK, where you have an enormous amount of people that are put on waiting lists because you know, scarcity still exists whether the government runs healthcare or not. It isn't about how you nationalize healthcare, whether it's private or public, because it's about how you actually provide that care, or it's also about how you, as a culture and a society, deal with being healthy. And in the United States has lower life expectancies because of the opioid epidemic, gun violence, obesity, and traffic deaths. So these are the fundamental issues in society that if you want to really bring that life expectancy up and make Americans better off, you deal with these things right here. Next major issue in society is immigration. The United States is seen around the world as a beacon of opportunity. That is fantastic. You want immigrants in this country. They are dynamic, they are economically much more positive for the American economy than a negative. And the problem right now is the American immigration system is simply totally screwed up. It is almost incomprehensible. It is enormously expensive to be an immigrant and come to this country and get yourself going. So if you would say, well, why don't you just do it the legal way? Well, if you got tens of thousands of dollars, lawyers, and years, you could figure out the immigration system to do that, which is why you have so many people coming here illegally. And that should be, by the way, a sign of something positive when people around the world want to come to your country. America is a very wealthy state. It is the leader in GDP around the world. It is also a very wealthy state on average. It is a leader in terms of GDP per capita. This does not mean there is not economic inequality. Global inequality has become way, 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 way lower in the last 40 years. US income inequality has actually gotten better since 2016 by a large margin. However, wealth inequality has become worse. What does that have to do with? Housing. Basically, owning a home is a sign of wealth, and that wealth transfers to future generations. And so, um, when we fix the housing, we're going to do a lot to fix income inequality. What are some of the wealthiest and poorest places in terms of GDP per capita in the country? The wealthiest include Princeton, Long Island, New York, Loudoun County, Fairfax County outside of Washington, D.C., the Denver area, and of course the San Francisco Bay Area. These are the wealthiest areas in some cases in the world. When you talk about the Bay Area, um, some of the poorest areas of the country are Appalachia in West Virginia and Western Virginia. You have Cook County in southern Georgia, the Mississippi River Valley, and then South Dakota Pine Ridge Reservation. Um, wa- Basically, massively poor, massive unemployment in Pine Ridge. Life expectancy is on par with like rural Nigeria, and someplace that's really unacceptable. So, making everybody better off, making sure that rising tide floats all boats. This is what we're working for in terms of the United States.